There was a time when the American night sounded different. Not the absolute silence of empty parking lots, nor the distant hum of endless highways. It was a softer sound, more human. Car doors closing gently, engines shutting off one by one, muffled laughter, the metallic click of a speaker being adjusted on a window, and then a voice coming from a small box hanging on the glass, clear enough to be heard, intimate enough to feel as if it were speaking only to you. Drive-ins were not just places to watch movies. They were pauses in time, quiet gathering points scattered along the edges of towns where no one felt in a hurry to leave. The sky darkened slowly, and the movie began even before the first image appeared on the screen. It began in the drive there, in the anticipation, in the ritual repeated hundreds of times across entire summers. Families arrived early, parking more or less in the same spot every time. Children in pajamas settled into the back seat, some already sleepy before the opening credits. Young couples spoke little, sharing sodas, hands meeting by accident in the dark. There was no rush. No one was there to consume content. They were there to stay. The white screen standing against the open sky seemed small during the day. But at night, when everything around it disappeared, it became the center of the world. A solitary light illuminating still faces, lined up in perfect rows of cars that seemed as though they might never move again. The wind crossed the open field, carrying the distant smell of popcorn, grass, asphalt warmed by the day. Drive-ins belonged to an America that believed in repetition, in the idea that doing the same thing in the same place with the same people was not boredom, it was belonging. They were built far from downtown where space was wide and cheap, but also where time seemed to slow down. There, the city did not press in. It watched from a distance. For decades, those open-air screens set the rhythm of the nights. Weekends had shape. They had a destination. There was little need to decide anything. The options were few, and that made everything simpler. The movie mattered, but not as much as the act of being there. Sometimes the sound failed. Sometimes the image shook. Sometimes no one paid attention until the end. And still, everyone came back. Because the drive-in did not offer constant novelty. It offered continuity. But little by little, something began to change. Not in a dramatic way. There was no specific day, no announcement, no official farewell. The lines grew shorter. A few empty spaces appeared between cars. Certain nights were canceled without explanation. The screen was still there, white and silent during the day, but it no longer pulled people in the same way, and no one noticed exactly when it was the last time. This is the story of a habit that did not disappear all at once. It is the story of places that kept waiting, even after people stopped arriving. Before drive-ins became memories, they were answers. They emerged quietly, without grand intentions, during a period when America was learning how to stretch outward. Cities were growing, but not upward. Roads expanded, suburbs multiplied, and the automobile stopped being a luxury and became a constant companion. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, the car was no longer just transportation, it was privacy on wheels. The first drive-ins were simple ideas shaped by circumstance. A wide piece of land, a large white screen, a projector strong enough to cut through the dark, sound delivered through speakers that clipped onto rolled-down windows. Nothing elegant. Nothing permanent. Just enough to work. What mattered was not sophistication, but accommodation. Indoor theaters had rules. Silence, darkness, stillness. They required a kind of social discipline that not everyone found comfortable. Parents worried about children fidgeting. Couples worried about being watched. Teenagers worried about being noticed at all. Drive-ins removed those pressures. In a car, no one could tell you to sit still. No one could hear your whispers. No usher would shine a flashlight in your direction. The car became a small moving living room. As the country emerged from war and moved into a period of expansion, drive-ins found their moment. The 1950s brought prosperity, but also a hunger for togetherness that felt safe and familiar. Families were larger, neighborhoods were quieter, Nights were less crowded with distractions. Going out did not mean being surrounded by strangers. It meant being near others without having to engage with them. Drive-ins fit that mood perfectly. They were built on the outskirts of towns, near highways and open fields, where land was inexpensive and neighbors were distant. From the road, they looked almost accidental. A tall screen rising from nothing, surrounded by rows of poles and gravel. During the day, they felt empty, unfinished. At night, they came alive. Cars rolled in slowly, headlights dimmed, engines idled. The parking rows filled in no particular order, yet always ended up forming something orderly, something calm. There was comfort in that repetition. People learned where to park, learned how far to roll down the window so the speaker cord wouldn't strain, learned which nights were busier, which films drew larger crowds. Drive-ins didn't demand attention, they invited it. They also allowed for a kind of blending that was rare elsewhere. Teenagers shared the same space as families, but lived in different worlds within it. Parents watched movies while children fell asleep behind them. Couples used the screen as background light, rather than a focal point. The experience was collective, but also deeply private. That balance was new. By the mid-1950s, drive-ins were no longer novelties. They were fixtures. Thousands dotted the country, from small rural towns to the edges of growing suburbs. Some were modest. Others expanded into full complexes with playgrounds, snack bars, picnic areas, even small amusement rides. They were designed not just to show films, but to hold people, to give them a reason to arrive early and leave late. The movie itself became only one part of the night. Children ran beneath the screen before dusk, their voices echoing in the open space. Parents unfolded lawn chairs beside their cars, talking quietly as the sky darkened. Radios were tuned, windows were wiped clean. The beginning of the film felt less like a start and more like a continuation. And because drive-ins were seasonal, they carried a sense of urgency that indoor theaters never had. Summer mattered, warm nights mattered, rain could cancel everything. Autumn brought a subtle sadness knowing the season was ending. Each visit felt finite, even when it was routine. That awareness made people linger. Drive-ins reflected a society that moved at a human pace. There was time to arrive, time to settle, time to leave slowly, headlights forming long, patient lines as cars filed out toward quiet streets. No one rushed to beat traffic. There was nowhere urgent to go. They also reflected a trust in shared space. Doors were unlocked. Windows stayed down. Children wandered. The world felt larger, but also safer. The drive-in sat between public and private life, never fully belonging to either. And for a while, it felt permanent. Few questioned whether these places would last. They were cheap to operate, popular, adaptable. Films came and went, but the structure stayed the same. New speakers replaced old ones. Projectors were upgraded. Screens were repainted. The ritual remained untouched. But permanence has a way of disguising fragility. Even in their golden years, drive-ins depended on conditions that were easy to overlook. Cheap land, cheap energy, cheap time. They required space in a world that had plenty of it, or so it seemed. They thrived in an era when fewer choices felt like freedom, not limitation. As the years passed, the country kept expanding. Roads multiplied, suburbs stretched farther. The automobile grew more powerful, more central. And yet, quietly, the environment that had made drive-ins feel inevitable began to shift. Not enough to alarm anyone. Not enough to stop the cars from coming. Not yet. The peak of the drive-in era did not arrive with fanfare. It settled in gradually, almost unnoticed, like a habit becoming tradition. By the early 1960s, drive-ins were no longer something people talked about. They were simply there, part of the landscape, as familiar as gas stations and diners. You didn't plan around them, you assumed them. On warm evenings, their glowing screens punctuated the edges of towns, visible from highways like quiet beacons, signaling that the day was not quite over yet. This was when the rhythm became fixed. Weekdays belonged to routine. Weekends belonged to the drive-in. Friday nights carried a gentle anticipation. Saturday evenings moved slower, as if the entire town understood that there was time to be spent somewhere else. Sunday nights felt softer, tinged with the knowledge that the week was returning soon. Drive-ins absorbed all of it. They became places where time blurred. Double features stretched, nights long past midnight. People dozed through parts of the second film and woke again before it ended. No one apologized for missing scenes. The experience was not linear. You drifted in and out, and that was allowed. This flexibility mirrored a larger calm in American life at the time. Homes were filling with televisions, but screens had not yet fragmented attention. Choices were still limited. Entertainment had weight because it was not endless. Going somewhere still meant committing to being there. At the drive-in, that commitment felt light. Snack bars grew larger and more central. Popcorn machines ran constantly. The smell became part of the memory, inseparable from the image on the screen. Menus were simple. Prices were low. Teenagers worked behind the counters, learning the rhythms of small responsibility, counting change under buzzing fluorescent lights. The drive-in was often one of the first jobs someone ever had, and it was one of the first places teenagers felt unsupervised without being alone. Cars offered shelter, but also freedom. Conversations stretched. Music played quietly before the film began. The screen provided an excuse to be together without having to perform. Adults noticed but rarely interfered. There was an unspoken understanding that drive-ins served different purposes to different people, all at once. Families treated them as extensions of home. Couples treated them as private corners in public space. Teenagers treated them as thresholds, places where childhood loosened its grip. That versatility was their strength. In rural areas, drive-ins were more than entertainment. They were events. Entire towns converged on them. Farmers parked dusty trucks beside polished sedans. People who might not otherwise cross paths sat within yards of each other, separated only by windshields and distance. No one spoke about community, but it happened anyway. The films themselves were often secondary. Westerns, romances, comedies, science fiction, they passed across the screen like weather. Some nights drew crowds, others were quieter. It didn't matter. The drive-in did not depend on novelty to survive. It depended on habit. And habits are powerful things. The layout of drive-ins encouraged stillness. Rows angled carefully to give every car a view. Speakers spaced evenly, humming softly even when not in use. Gravel crunching under tires became part of the soundtrack. Everything moved slowly, deliberately. There was no urgency built into the space. Even leaving took time. Engines started one by one. Headlights flicked on, then dimmed. Lines formed naturally without honking or impatience. People waved as they passed each other, acknowledging shared time rather than shared destination. For many, these moments mattered more than the films. Drive-ins also carried an optimism that felt subtle but persistent. They assumed good weather. They assumed people would come. They assumed there would always be another summer. The structures themselves were open, exposed, trusting. They were not built to defend against change, and yet during their peak, there was no reason to believe they needed to. Attendance was strong. Land was still available. Cars grew larger, more comfortable, better suited to long evenings parked in place. Fuel was affordable. Night air felt predictable. Nothing seemed fragile. What few noticed was that the drive-in's success was tied to balance. A balance between space and distance, between public and private, between novelty and familiarity. As long as those forces stayed aligned, the system held. But balances are sensitive. Small shifts rarely announce themselves. They don't feel like endings. They feel like conveniences, improvements, progress. One more option added to the list. One more reason to stay home. One more screen glowing indoors. At first, these changes felt harmless. A family might skip a weekend. A teenager might choose a different place to go. A drive-in might close earlier on quieter nights. None of it seemed connected. None of it felt permanent. The screen still lit up. The cars still arrived. The rituals continued. But beneath the calm surface, the conditions that made drive-ins effortless were beginning to tighten, slowly, quietly, without urgency. And no one was listening for the sound of that change. The erosion did not begin with collapse. It began with convenience. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, American life started to compress inward. Houses grew larger, but families grew quieter. Television moved from novelty to fixture, from shared event to background presence. Screens no longer required a destination. They waited in living rooms, already glowing. For the first time, staying home became easier than going out. This did not empty drive-ins overnight. It thinned them. A few cars less on a Tuesday. A half-full row on a Friday that once overflowed. Patterns changed first, numbers later. At the same time, the land around drive-ins began to matter in a new way. What had once been cheap and distant was now desirable. Suburbs pushed outward, absorbing the open fields that had made drive-ins possible. Property taxes rose quietly. Zoning rules shifted. What had been empty space became potential, for housing, for retail, for roads. The drive-in screen stood still while everything around it accelerated. Operating costs crept upward in small increments. Repairs took longer, projectors aged, speakers broke and went unreplaced. None of this felt urgent on its own. Owners adjusted. They always had. Drive-ins were adaptable by nature, but adaptation began to change their character. Some added flea markets during the day. Others hosted swap meets, concerts, revival screenings. A few tried to modernize, brighter snack bars, newer films, louder sound. These efforts kept them alive, but they also signaled something unspoken. Survival was no longer automatic. Weather, once a mild inconvenience, became a liability. A rainy weekend could mean the difference between breaking even and falling behind. Seasons felt shorter. Summers felt less reliable. Each cancellation carried more weight than before. Inside the cars, behavior shifted too. People arrived later, left earlier, paid less attention to the screen. The drive-in was no longer the evening's focus. It was one option among many. The patience that once defined the experience thinned, replaced by restlessness. The world was speeding up. The 1970s brought a series of quiet pressures that drive-ins were not designed to absorb. Energy costs fluctuated. Cars, once symbols of freedom, became expenses to manage. The long, idle hours that drive-ins required felt less natural in a culture growing accustomed to efficiency. Meanwhile, indoor theaters adapted quickly. They multiplied screens, shortened gaps between showings, moved closer to shopping centers and population hubs. They offered climate control, predictability, year-round operation. What drive-ins offered an atmosphere they could not match in consistency. Choice began to favor convenience. None of this required a dramatic decision. No one woke up and declared drive-ins obsolete. The habit simply weakened. Attendance dipped unevenly. Profitable nights grew rarer. The margins thinned. Owners faced decisions that earlier generations never had to consider. Repair the screen or delay another season. Upgrade sound or reduce staff. Sell the land or hold on and hope. Hope lingered longer than logic. Drive-ins had survived earlier changes. They had outlasted trends. They trusted that people would return because they always had. But the nature of return had changed. Memory alone could not sustain attendance. For younger generations, the drive-in was no longer a given. It was an experience they tried once, not a routine they inherited. Nostalgia began to replace familiarity, and nostalgia is fragile. It visits, but it does not stay. As suburbs pressed closer, complaints followed. Light pollution, noise, traffic. The same openness that once made drive-ins invisible now made them intrusive. Screens that had stood alone for decades were suddenly surrounded. The drive-in, once on the edge, found itself in the way. Gradually, closures began. Quietly, one by one. A season skipped, a screen left standing without films, grass growing taller in the parking rows, speakers dangling unused, cords stiff with age. There were no ceremonies, no final nights announced in advance. Most people learned a drive-in was gone only after they tried to return. The screen would still be there sometimes, faded, cracked, a shape without purpose. In other places, the land was cleared entirely. A store rose where rows of cars once sat. A housing development replaced the open field. The memory flattened into something unrecognizable. And yet, for a long time, the losses felt isolated. One town here, another there. It did not yet feel like the end of something national. Just a series of local changes, each justified on its own terms. The idea of the drive-in persisted even as the reality faded. People spoke about them in the past tense without realizing it. We used to go. There was one outside town. I remember when. The language shifted before the habit did. By the time the pattern became clear, most of the screens were already dark. Not because anyone decided they should be, but because the world around them had learned how to move without them. And the drive-ins built for waiting had no way to catch up. What followed was not disappearance, but quiet survival. By the time it became clear that drive-ins were no longer returning to their former place, a smaller number remained, scattered, stubborn, often family-owned. These were not businesses chasing growth anymore. They were caretakers of something already slipping into memory. The experience changed. Where once drive-ins felt anonymous and effortless, now they felt intentional. People didn't stumble into them. They sought them out. A visit required planning, checking schedules, watching the weather. Attendance became uneven, driven by novelty, nostalgia, or tradition rather than habit. The crowds that came were different too. Older couples returned to places that mirrored their own past. Parents brought children not because it was convenient, but because it felt important, as though the experience itself needed to be witnessed before it vanished. Teenagers arrived with cameras, documenting something they sensed was fragile even if they couldn't articulate why. The drive-in had become symbolic. Operators adapted in ways that blurred the line between preservation and improvisation. Some embraced their aging equipment, treating imperfections as part of the charm. Flickering images, uneven sound, worn screens. These were no longer flaws to fix, but textures of authenticity. Others modernized just enough to survive. Digital projection replaced film in a few places. Speakers were phased out for radio transmissions. Snack bars added new items, hosted theme nights, leaned into retro branding. But none of it restored the old rhythm. What had once been automatic now depended on effort. Weather dictated attendance. Competing entertainment options multiplied. Each season felt uncertain. Opening night carried more anxiety than anticipation. The drive-in no longer assumed a future. In many towns, survival depended on a single family or individual who refused to let go. Owners lived on the property. They repaired screens themselves. They worked snack bars at night and handled maintenance by day. Profit mattered less than continuity. They were not expanding a business. They were protecting a memory. This devotion gave remaining drive-ins a different atmosphere. Nights felt quieter, even when crowds were present. People spoke softly. Children played closer to their parents. The space carried awareness, the sense that everyone there knew they were participating in something that might not last. That awareness altered behavior. Cars stayed longer after the film ended. People lingered, reluctant to be the first to leave. The drive-in had become less about routine and more about presence. You didn't come casually anymore. You came deliberately. And deliberate experiences do not repeat as easily. As years passed, the drive-in's place in culture shifted again. It was no longer part of the present. It became a reference point, a symbol invoked in conversations about simpler times, about patience, about shared space. It appeared in films, photographs, articles, always framed as something already gone, even when it still existed. Survival did not equal relevance. Meanwhile, the physical structures aged in plain sight. Screens weathered decades of sun and wind. Parking rows eroded. Poles leaned. Repairs became more cosmetic than restorative. Everything existed on borrowed time. Local governments rarely intervened. Preservation efforts were inconsistent. Drive-ins did not fit neatly into historical categories. They were too recent to be ancient, too informal to be monuments. They fell between definitions, so they were left alone. When closures happened in this era, they were often final, not temporary pauses, but decisions shaped by exhaustion. Owners retired. Land values peaked. Maintenance outpaced revenue. The reasons were practical, unremarkable. That was the hardest part. There was no villain, no single force to blame, no moment of betrayal. The drive-in faded not because it failed, but because the conditions that once sustained it no longer aligned. In some towns, the screen remained long after the last showing. A white rectangle against the sky, unlit, unused. People drove past without stopping. Children grew up never knowing what it had been for. The structure outlived the memory. In others, even the screen disappeared. Bulldozers arrived early in the morning. By afternoon, the ground was level. By evening, the field was empty. The erasure was efficient, almost gentle. What lingered was not grief, but absence. The drive-in had once taught people how to wait, for dusk, for sound to connect, for the movie to begin. It had rewarded stillness. It had made room for boredom, for drifting attention, for shared silence. Those lessons did not transfer well to a faster world. As entertainment became personalized, portable, immediate, the idea of gathering without urgency felt outdated. The drive-in required surrender to time. The modern world asked for control over it. And so the remaining screens stood as contradictions. Places built for slowness in a culture that no longer valued it. They existed, but out of sync. Those who returned did so knowing this. They came not to relive the past exactly, but to stand near it, to feel the scale of open space at night, to hear the wind cross an empty field, to watch light move across a screen that once anchored entire towns. They came because something about the place resisted explanation. And resistance, in a world that moves forward without pause, is easy to overlook until it is gone entirely. By the time the drive-in became rare, its meaning had already changed. What once felt ordinary now felt ceremonial. A trip to a surviving drive-in no longer blended into the week. It stood apart from it. People spoke about it in advance. They checked weather forecasts with care. They packed blankets, radios, folding chairs, snacks brought from home, as if preparing for something that required intention rather than impulse. The effort itself became part of the experience. This shift revealed something deeper. Drive-ins had never been only about movies. They had been about surrendering to a shared pace, about accepting that an evening could not be optimized, shortened, or improved by choice. You arrived when you arrived. You stayed until it ended. You left when everyone else did. That kind of time had quietly vanished. Modern entertainment offered control, pause, rewind, skip, leave early, switch screens. The drive-in offered none of that. It demanded patience, and patience had become unfamiliar. What once felt relaxing now felt restrictive to those who had grown up without it. For many younger visitors, the drive-in felt strangely heavy. The silence between sounds, the long gaps between moments, the sense that nothing was pushing the night forward. Some found it comforting. Others felt restless, unsure of what they were supposed to do with so much unstructured time. That discomfort was telling. The drive-in had been built for a society comfortable with waiting for images to sharpen, for sound to settle, for dusk to fully arrive. It trusted that people would stay present even when nothing demanded their attention. But presence had become optional elsewhere. As fewer drive-ins remained, those that survived began to feel like anomalies. Not because they were old, but because they operated by rules that no longer matched the surrounding world. Their emptiness was no longer seasonal. It was structural. Even on good nights, something felt thinner. The crowd sizes fluctuated unpredictably. A full lot one weekend could be followed by a nearly empty one the next. Patterns no longer held. Loyalty weakened. Attendance depended less on tradition and more on novelty, weather, or chance. Owners learned to expect uncertainty, and with uncertainty came caution. Repairs were postponed. Investments were minimized. Long-term plans dissolved into short-term survival. Each season was treated as provisional, not assumed. This mindset changed the atmosphere. Where drive-ins once radiated confidence, the quiet belief that they would open again next summer, now they carried hesitation. Conversations turned inward. Decisions felt heavier. Every night mattered, not because it was special, but because it might be one of the last. The audience sensed this, even if they didn't articulate it. There was a subtle grief woven into the experience, not loud enough to name, but present in the way people lingered after the credits, in the way they looked around before leaving, as if taking mental inventory of the space. Grief without an ending is difficult to process. Because drive-ins did not vanish all at once, there was no collective moment of recognition. No national farewell, no final season announced across the country. Each closure happened quietly, locally, absorbed without ceremony. The loss never accumulated enough momentum to feel urgent. Instead, it scattered into individual memories, a place your family used to go, a night you remember clearly, a screen you passed on the highway for years without stopping. These fragments did not form a narrative. They drifted independently, and drift is easy to ignore. As time passed, even the idea of the drive-in shifted again. It became a shorthand for nostalgia, a symbol rather than a place. Something referenced in stories, advertisements, and imagery to evoke warmth, innocence, simplicity. But symbols flatten what they represent. The real drive-in was never tidy or idealized. It was imperfect, inconvenient, weather-dependent, sometimes boring. It asked more of people than it gave. It required showing up even when the film was forgettable, even when the night was cool, even when nothing remarkable happened. That requirement was its quiet strength. Without it, the remaining drive-ins began to feel less like living spaces and more like reenactments. The past was no longer continuing, it was being visited. And visits, no matter how sincere, do not replace continuity. Eventually, for many, even the visit stopped. The screen still stood. The land remained open. But the flow of people thinned to a trickle. Some nights passed without a single car. Projectors sat idle. Snack bars stayed closed. Silence returned, heavier than before. The drive-in had become a place waiting for a habit that no longer existed. What lingered was not outrage or protest, but resignation. A shared understanding that some things end not because they are rejected, but because the world no longer makes room for them. The drive-in did not lose to something better. It lost to something faster. And speed, once embraced, rarely slows down again. Those who remembered the drive-in clearly understood this loss in a way that could not be explained. They spoke less about films and more about nights, less about stories and more about space, less about entertainment and more about how it felt to be there. They remembered not what they watched, but how long they stayed, and that memory carried a quiet weight, the realization that an entire way of spending time together had faded without being replaced by anything equally shared. What remained were individuals, each with their own screen, their own schedule, their own control. The drive-in had asked people to look in the same direction at the same time. The world had learned how to live without that request, and once that happened, the screens no longer knew who they were waiting for. In the end, the drive-in did not leave behind ruins in the traditional sense. It left behind spaces, empty fields where the ground still remembers the weight of cars, slight depressions where tires once rested night after night, faded access roads that lead nowhere in particular. If you stand in the right place, you can still sense the order that once existed there. Rows aligned toward a single point, a geometry built around waiting. The absence feels deliberate, even though it wasn't. Unlike abandoned factories or closed theaters, drive-ins rarely decay into something dramatic. There are no interiors to collapse, no seats to rot, no curtains to gather dust. When they are gone, they are simply gone. The land resets quickly, grass grows, buildings rise. The shape of the past disappears almost completely. What survives lives elsewhere. It survives in habits that no longer make sense. In the instinct to arrive early somewhere, there is no reason to. In the comfort some people still find in sitting inside a parked car at night, engine off, radio low, watching light move across darkness. In the unease that comes from leaving too quickly, even when there is nothing left to see. The drive-in taught people how to share time without filling it. That lesson does not translate easily into modern life. Time is now segmented, optimized, individualized. Even shared experiences are often consumed separately, synchronized only by algorithms rather than presence. The idea of gathering without urgency feels inefficient, and inefficiency, once labeled, is difficult to defend. What the drive-in offered was not spectacle. It was tolerance for slowness. A belief that being together did not require constant interaction, that silence could be collective without being awkward, that attention could drift without being lost. Those values faded quietly. The loss of drive-ins did not spark debates or movements because it did not feel like a loss at first. It felt like progress adjusting its shape. New conveniences filled the gap. New options multiplied. Choice expanded. But expansion scattered what had once been shared. When people speak about drive-ins now, they rarely describe them accurately. They smooth the edges. They remember warmth without discomfort, togetherness without boredom. Memory edits what reality held in balance. What is forgotten is that the experience worked precisely because it demanded so little explanation. You didn't have to justify why you were there. That simplicity no longer exists in the same way. Modern gatherings are planned, framed, documented. They ask for intention, meaning purpose. The drive-in asked only that you arrive and wait. Waiting together has become unfamiliar. Some of the remaining screens still stand, stubborn and quiet. They open a few nights a year. They survive on volunteers, donations, novelty. They are loved but not depended on. And dependence, more than affection, is what once sustained them. Without dependence, nothing stays central. These surviving drive-ins function less as places and more as reminders. They remind people that time once moved differently, that evenings could stretch without being filled, that public space could exist without constant activity. They do not ask to be restored. They simply exist briefly when allowed. Eventually, even these reminders will fade, not because anyone chooses to erase them, but because memory thins as those who lived the experience firsthand disappear. What remains will be stories, simplified, softened, incomplete. And stories, no matter how lovingly told, cannot recreate routine. The drive-in's true disappearance did not happen when the last screen went dark. It happened earlier when people stopped arranging their lives around a shared pause, when staying home felt equivalent to going out, when being alone together no longer felt necessary. By then, the structures were already irrelevant. What replaces the drive-in is not another place but a condition, a world where experiences are portable, private, adjustable, where time bends to individual preference, where nothing requires you to stay longer than you want. That freedom comes with cost. The drive-in once held people in place long enough for memory to form naturally, not because something extraordinary happened, but because nothing interrupted it. The night unfolded at its own pace, indifferent to schedules. That indifference was rare even then. Now it is almost extinct. If you search for what was lost, you won't find it in photographs or screens. You'll find it in the discomfort some people feel with unfilled time, in the urge to leave early, in the difficulty of staying still when nothing demands attention. Those reactions are the echo of something once learned and then forgotten. The drive-in was never meant to last forever. Few things built on open land and shared patience are. But it revealed something fundamental about how people once moved through evenings, through communities, through silence. It showed that togetherness did not require closeness, that entertainment did not require intensity, that time did not need to be controlled to be meaningful. When it disappeared, those ideas went with it. and the world did not replace them. It simply moved faster. What remains is the outline of a screen against a dark sky, faint but recognizable. A reminder that for a while people were willing to stop their cars, turn off their engines, and wait together for something to begin. Not because it promised novelty, but because it gave them permission to stay,